December 7, 1941, Japan launched a massive surprise air attack on the American base at Pearl Harbor. Within 2 hours, dozens of American ships were ablaze, along with hundreds of their planes. Thus, the Empire of the Rising Sun began its ambitious and bloody campaign of conquest across the Pacific. This naval base was not Japan's only target. Almost simultaneously, all of the European colonies in Southeast Asia were besieged by brutal Japanese soldiers. The reason for this large-scale offensive was obvious. Only with a lightning attack could they seize all the resources necessary for final victory. If they failed, defeat would be the only fate that awaited them. Today, in this new episode of military history, we will tell you all about Japan's brutal initial campaigns during World War II and their terrible cost.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Historically, World War II began on September 1st, 1939, with the invasion of Poland by German forces. However, some historians argue that the start of the war began a few years earlier. On July 7, 1937, after decades of tensions and minor clashes, Japan launched a massive invasion of China. Within months, many of its most important cities, such as Shanghai and Nanjing, fell into Japanese hands. Imperial soldiers, who regarded their enemies as subhumans, quickly committed terrible atrocities against civilians and captured prisoners of war. Although the conflict did not spread until 1939, all the major powers were watching these battles. Germany was allied with the Japanese Empire, while England and the United States had joint interests with China. Uncle Sam's nation feared that the Japanese would use their conquests as a springboard to expand into European colonies in Southeast Asia. It was not long before his suspicions were confirmed. By the end of 1940, the war had finally spread to Europe, with many of its great powers involved, although the Nazis had a clear advantage. France had fallen surprisingly quickly, and the British had been driven from the mainland to their island. The United States, for its part, had not yet decided to support its allies, reluctant to join a new armed conflict. Japan took advantage of the chaos to invade French bases in Indochina, knowing that it would hardly encounter any resistance. But although it did not suffer military setbacks, it did suffer in the economic field. The Americans decided to embargo the sale of oil to the Asian country. From one day to the next, the Japanese lost their main market, and their entire war industry was in danger. Hirohito, the emperor at the time, along with General Tojo and other Japanese leaders, now faced a stark choice: retreat to protect their reserves and use them to fight China, or conquer more territory and seize the oil by force.
The oil embargo in place, Japan develops a two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, it's trying to negotiate a diplomatic solution and sends a representative to Washington to try to find a way out. And the emperor is generally trying to find a peaceful solution. But the military is also planning for an attack.
Knowing the humiliation that diplomatic means would bring, the Japanese opted for the second option, taking up arms. Their plan was extremely ambitious. They were to simultaneously attack the main Pacific Ocean territories controlled by the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, and the United States. Only in this way, by taking all these colonies at once, could they achieve victory, since they knew that in a prolonged war, they had a great chance of losing. But despite the risks of the operation, the Japanese were confident. They saw their rivals as weak and cowardly, especially the Americans. They believed that if they were able to destroy their Pacific fleet, which was concentrated around the base of Pearl Harbor, they would be forced to ask for peace. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was entrusted with this mission. Under his command were 10 battleships, 10 aircraft carriers, and hundreds of the latest aircraft.
Against him, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had 8 World War I vintage battleships and 2 carriers. Yamamoto planned the attack with great care. He would hit the US fleet in Pearl Harbor on a Sunday, since, according to intelligence reports, it usually spent the weekends in port.
This meant that the ships would be in port, where they would be easy prey for bombing. December 7th, 1941, was chosen as the fateful date for the offensive. To make the attack even more surprising, a Japanese delegation traveled to Washington a few days earlier to negotiate a possible Japanese withdrawal from Chinese territory. The Americans had no idea that one of the key moments of the entire Second World War would soon arrive. At 6 a.m. on December 7th, the first wave of aircraft took off from the aircraft carriers located just a few leagues from the base. Most of the soldiers and sailors stationed at Pearl Harbor were just beginning to wake up when the sirens began to sound. Just as Yamamoto had planned, they were taken completely by surprise.
Five US ships were hit immediately.
"21 ships were sunk, most of them unable to respond, and air bases were destroyed by bombs from Japanese planes. Within hours, the American naval port lay in ruins as fire devoured everything in its path. Before the defenders could mount a counteroffensive, the attackers retreated back into the open ocean, leaving behind only chaos and destruction.
It was all over in less than 2¼ hours. Yamamoto's plan had worked like a dream. Or had it?
The two American aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor were not at the base at the time of the attack, so they were not damaged. Other ships that initially seemed to have been put out of action only suffered minor damage, and in just a couple of months could be back in the water. In addition, the opinion of the American public, which had been against the war, now turned completely in the opposite direction. Thousands took to the streets calling on then-President Franklin Roosevelt to join the Allies, and he did so the very next day. But as mentioned above, Pearl Harbor was not the only target of Yamamoto and his fleet. Almost simultaneously, the colonies of the European powers in Southeast Asia were invaded by Japanese soldiers, supported by their powerful air and naval forces.
It thought it had knocked out America. Now it moved against Britain and its colonies. The first to be hit was Malaya, where a Japanese force came ashore in the northeast of the country.
Malaya and Burma tried to resist the advance of the attackers, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the enemy. The Japanese's main mission was to conquer Singapore at the southern tip of Malaysia. This place served as one of the main British bases in the region, and whoever controlled it would have a great advantage over their opponents. The Europeans had turned Singapore into a fortress that they believed was impenetrable, but they made a grave mistake. They expected an attack by sea. The Japanese, however, had other plans. Even though approximately 30,000 Imperial soldiers were rapidly descending through the dense Malayan jungle, the British were calm. They saw the Japanese as disorganized and almost barbaric fighters. They maintained that the only reason for their victory at Pearl Harbor had been due to the element of surprise. But now that they knew they were coming, they would not stand a chance. Nevertheless, the enemy continued to advance. When they were close enough to the city, they began a brutal aerial bombardment of Singapore that destroyed much of its infrastructure. 2 British ships were moved towards the island to confront the attackers, but in less than 2 hours both had been destroyed, with thousands of sailors perishing in the waters of the Pacific. This defeat was the worst maritime disaster for the United Kingdom in the entire Second World War, but it would not be the last humiliation suffered on this battlefront. By January 11, 1942, almost all of Malaysia had been conquered. The British defenders, approximately 100,000 men, were at the base in Singapore awaiting the enemy attack, As mentioned before, the defenses of the fort had been designed for a naval invasion. The huge 15-inch guns, for example, were aimed directly at the sea. So when the final Japanese offensive was carried out on land, they were of no use in stopping them.
The Japanese launched an assault in early February. It was supported by more airstrikes. The British defense was soon reduced to chaos. Civilian casualties began to escalate.
For 4 days, the British tried to hold out as long as possible, seeking to inflict as many casualties on the enemy as possible. But reinforcements were never sent, and knowing that postponing the fighting would only mean more defenders dead, they eventually surrendered. More than 90,000 British soldiers became prisoners of war in what turned out to be the largest surrender of an English force in history. This defeat not only meant the loss of the important naval base at Singapore, but also marked the beginning of the collapse of the British Empire in Asia. Elsewhere on the continent, the Japanese continued to reap success after success. In the Philippines, an American colony, the Japanese had managed to eliminate American air bases through intense bombing. Without encountering any resistance, they were able to land on its shores in freedom. The defenders were quickly surrounded by the attackers and had to give up miles of territory. In just 10 days, Manila, their capital, had been captured. Uncle Sam's surviving soldiers were forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, the last point of control in their hands. As with the British in Singapore, they sought to hold out as long as possible until their superiors sent reinforcements. And as their hopes were in vain. On April 3, 1942, a massive Japanese assault swept away the defenders, who had to surrender a week later. Before boarding the ship on which he was evacuated, General MacArthur, in charge of the American forces, declared, "I will return." With the fall of the Philippines, the only remaining Allied base in Asia was Burma. This English colony had held out a little longer than the others, but the final results were no different.
The British defenses had been utterly neglected. There were only some 15,000 men defending the country. They were no match for the Japanese. The Allied troops mounted a brief but doomed resistance.
Like the rest of the bases on this continent, the equipment of the garrison was simply inferior to that of the Japanese. The 15,000 British in charge of resisting could do little to contain the Japanese offensive. In May 1942, the last remaining defenders in the country were finally driven out by the attackers. In just 6 months, the Japanese Empire had taken over almost the entire Pacific Ocean. The bases of the European and North American powers were in their hands, and everything seemed to indicate that this would continue. Yamamoto's plan for a lightning attack had worked perfectly, or at least that's what they thought. The reality was that, despite their numerous victories, they had not been able to achieve one of their main objectives. As previously stated, the American aircraft carriers had not been affected by the attack on Pearl Harbor, so the fleet had not been destroyed as the Japanese had wished. Furthermore, Uncle Sam's high industrial capacity meant that within a few months, he was already in a position to return the blows he had received. Knowing that victory was not yet assured with the territories won, the Japanese leaders decided to expand their conquests. Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands would serve as bases from which they could threaten Australia, one of their greatest rivals in the area. So that was where they sought to attack on May 3, 1942. The islands fell quickly, but the Americans had an ace up their sleeve. They had been able to decipher Japanese communications, and so they knew when and where the offensive would be to take the rest of the objectives. When the Japanese fleet entered the Coral Sea in preparation for the invasion of Papua New Guinea, the American ships were waiting for it. The naval battles lasted 2 days before the Japanese withdrew. In practical terms, the battle was a draw, since both sides lost an aircraft carrier. But it was actually a major tactical victory for the Allies, as Australia was now out of imminent danger. The Japanese, however, did not sit idly by. Their next target was the Midway Islands near Hawaii. From there, they would be able to launch another devastating attack on Pearl Harbor that would this time put the fleet out of action once and for all. But they were not yet aware that the Americans could listen in and read all their communications. Once the objective of the next attack was clear, they planned a naval ambush against the Imperial Navy. The Battle of Midway began on June 4, 1942. It is considered by many to be the turning point of the entire theater of operations in the Pacific. Both sides decided to risk everything, moving most of their aircraft carriers into combat. Hundreds of ships and planes faced each other for 3 days in the blue waters around the islands. For a moment, it seemed that the Japanese, led by Admiral Nagumo, had gained the upper hand, as the antiquated American planes were unable to damage their ships. But while the Japanese fought off the fighters, American bombers, which had remained out of radar range, swooped down from high altitudes.
US dive bombers, approaching unseen at high altitude, hurtled down on these ships. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. Nagumo had gambled once too often and was now at the mercy of American air power. Within 5 minutes, the US dive bombers had reduced 3 of Japan's largest aircraft carriers to flaming wrecks. All would later sink.
The destruction was total. All 4 Imperial aircraft carriers were reduced to ashes by bombs, and the loss of more than 300 aircraft and approximately 2,000 men was added. The United States, for its part, lost only 1 of these ships. After Midway, Japan was deprived of its naval power. For the duration of the war, it was never again able to threaten the Allies. It was now completely on the defensive, while the Americans prepared their massive counterattack.
Late in the afternoon that day, the Hiryu was also hit and turned into a blazing pile. In a matter of hours, Japan's mastery of the sea had been destroyed. The attack on Midway Island had achieved nothing.
But the Japanese were still far from being defeated. In land battles, they had not yet known defeat. Seeing their plans for maritime conquest faded, they decided to strengthen their position on the mainland. That was why they once again focused on the region of Papua New Guinea, in addition to strengthening their bases in the Solomon Islands. As mentioned, from there they could threaten the cities of Australia by air. But unlike previous campaigns, they would now face serious difficulties. The defenders had learned to fight in the dense jungles of the Pacific, and Japanese supplies remained scarce. In addition, Allied naval superiority meant that reinforcements brought by sea frequently ended in disaster, with most of the soldiers drowned or captured. One of the most important Solomon Islands for the Japanese was Guadalcanal. There, the Imperials had built an airfield from which they could attack the maritime convoys that supplied the Americans. Knowing that the Americans were preparing to invade, the Imperials strengthened their defenses. This next battle would determine their final victory or defeat. The Allies landed on the island on August 7, 1942. At first, they met no resistance. The Japanese let them settle in peace for the first day, but if the Americans thought that meant they were ready to surrender, they were very much mistaken. During the night, a naval force destroyed the American ships on the coast. The few ships that remained had to flee. The Allies now found themselves completely isolated in the jungle. But the Japanese were not able to take advantage of their situation. They decided to retreat inland to strengthen their position, but this allowed the Allies to take the airfield for themselves. Thus, the Imperial soldiers were deprived of their airbase, from which they could stop the arrival of enemy reinforcements. The Japanese situation had become desperate.
It took the Allies another 2 months before the Japanese were finally overwhelmed. It had been a bloodbath.
During these campaigns, the Japanese began to use the dreaded tactic of suicide attacks. Hundreds or thousands of Imperial soldiers would rush toward the Americans, firing their rifles or brandishing their swords. But the well-positioned defenders would often mow them down with their machine guns. Japanese officers did not resort to this strategy for the results, but rather as a way to safeguard their honor. They preferred death in combat to surrender or fall victim to the hunger or disease that often plagued these islands. The battles on Guadalcanal lasted for months, but the chances of Imperial victory were never great. By early 1943, both sides were extremely exhausted. Neither had been able to bring fresh soldiers to the front. But in late January of that year, American ships were able to bring in reinforcements that replaced the exhausted combatants. With this new push, the Allies began another offensive. The Japanese, almost out of ammunition, medicine, and food, were unable to cope. Of the approximately 35,000 Japanese soldiers on the island in mid-1942, it is believed that only 1,000 survived.
By early February 1943, the Americans had finally won control of Guadalcanal. They had now beaten the Japanese at sea and on land. They had even denied them access to the air. The Oriental Blitzkrieg had failed.
There were still dozens of islands in Japanese hands, as well as much of Southeast Asia, but it was only a matter of time before their fall. The objective of the Blitzkrieg to seize the precious resources necessary for the operation of their war machine had failed, and with it, the chances of victory. In Guadalcanal, almost 3 years before Japan's final surrender, their fate had been sealed. We've reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, what do you think the Japanese should have done differently during their Pacific campaign? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.